Hi, I'm Betty McClellan. This is the second in a series of interviews I'm conducting with Pauline Woodbridge around the issue of domestic and family violence in Australia. Pauline, it's really important that we talk about the philosophy that informs your work. I've known you for many years, and you seem to be as motivated today as you were when you first started working in this area. What is it that motivates you? What is it that has enabled you to maintain your passion over 30 years on the job?
It'd be great if I could respond to that by saying it's because, things have gone up in a natural kind of way, that we've made so many inroads, that we've made a real change, that we actually were protecting women in Australia against violence, in all of its forms of violence against women. It'd be a great answer to be able to say that's what motivates me and keeps me in there. But the reality is, it seems like we take a couple of steps forward and you just get a lot of hope about that, and then it feels like there's steps backwards and governments change and policies change, or we have unintended outcomes for some of the things that we're doing. And so that motivates me again, that you've got to stay in there and keep the same message going, that violence against women is wrong and that we can solve it, because an awful lot of people in our society don't even believe that we can solve it. So it's things like that that keep me motivated after all these years, and still hopeful that we can make a real difference with this.
Well, that's really good, Pauline. Now, I know you base your work with perpetrators on the Duluth model. I want to ask you about that. There are those who say that the Duluth model is outdated, that what perpetrators really need is counselling or anger management courses, or perhaps the couple needs to have counselling when there's violence involved in the relationship. I wonder what you think about that. First, if you will, tell us about the Duluth model, what it is, and then comment on its continued relevance or not.
You do hear that comment made that the Duluth model is, it's not significant, or it's passé, or comments like that, but it's usually made by people who don't actually understand what the Duluth model is about. I guess because my understanding of domestic violence is based on a gender or a feminist analysis, and it looks at gender as the primary problem in domestic violence, that's why the Duluth model makes absolute sense. So if you've got a gendered lens or a feminist lens, Duluth model is the most popular one, the one that makes the most sense, that fits with those theories. The people who have the other theories, similar to what you talked about, the poor man, or he needs counselling, or he needs anger management and so on, may well want to choose other models or other methods because it fits within that philosophy. But if you've got a very firm philosophy that domestic violence or violence against women is caused by the unequal gender relationships between men and women in our society, a feminist analysis that tells us about the patriarchy, the effects of patriarchy, the way it affects women, the way women's lives are dictated by patriarchy, all of those sorts of analysis seems to in some ways turn us towards the power and control model that is at the very heart of Duluth. The curious thing about, even though people who are Duluth deniers, is very often, even in their programs, they use some of the methods or some of the content of Duluth. So it's, I think, a lot of myth around what Duluth is, what it stands for, what it actually means, and how it gets applied is often just a piecemeal picked at and criticised, which in reality it is a whole program. It's extremely holistic. So it's not just about how you work with individual men or how you work with the men in the group. It's about the whole philosophy about why we're doing this work, why it's important to do men's behaviour change programs, the way we think about the victims of men's violence, the way we respond systemically. So we need to have integrated approaches. That means that programs are accountable, they're transparent, they're monitored, especially by women's services. All of those things are elements of the Duluth model. And so it's easy to see why patriarchal driven programs or ideas or philosophies would be quite anti-Duluth, I think.
Well, what is it then that the media and so many people out there in the community believe that violent men, even men who murder their partners or children, are really basically good men? I remember when a father, a teacher at a Brisbane school, took his little 2-year-old son and threw him off the Story Bridge, and then of course threw himself off afterwards in an act of suicide. And I remember that in the media was full of stories about what a good bloke he was, what a loving father. Now I remember saying at the time, well, no loving father I know would ever throw their child off a bridge to their death. So what's that all about, do you think, Pauline? Why is our society so reluctant to condemn men's violent and even murderous behaviour?
Our feminist analysis of patriarchy, I think, really does help us analyse what that story is about, why we would have such a view. For a man to kill his child and then to kill himself, in the normal course of events, we would think that would be quite heinous and almost not being able to understand it. But then our community understands it from a point of view that kind of says, well, he must have been driven to it, or he must have been beside himself, or the poor man didn't know what to do. Our community doesn't seem to have much trouble trying to understand what happened. But if you're a feminist with a feminist analysis of what's going on with violence against women, our first response was not about a poor man not knowing what to do, but a man who knew how to send a very, very strong message to his partner, a punishing message, a message that says, you can't get away with anything, I am going to teach you a lesson, you are going to suffer, whatever the kind of messages he had in his own mind about this, that said that she was going to be punished. And because obviously they were separated and there was family court orders in place. So she had to pay the price. And what better price could there be than to attack her at one of the most vital parts of her life, which is one of her children. And to then kill yourself afterwards can often be seen again as an act of desperation, but again, our analysis would be saying, yes, well, now you're not accountable. You're going to avoid any kind of being, punished yourself or being held accountable and so on. So it's a very neat package, I think, and it's going to be quite hard for people to be listening to this and thinking, gosh, she must hate men that much that she thinks men are motivated like this. But we need to be quite clear about what's going on in domestic violence. The violence against women or domestic violence are not just desperate acts by desperate men. They are men who are using a pattern of behaviour that uses power and control, but uses punishment as very much part of that behavioural pattern. And these are the ultimate forms, I believe, of punishment. There's many, many stories like this. There's stories about women being forced to watch their children be killed in front of them, for example, and we've had a recent one in Queensland that tells us about that. There's stories of a woman being shot in the leg while he then proceeded to shoot the children who were in the bed with her, so that she would be forced to watch that death of her children. It's a very powerful message. We really need to be seeing it in quite different ways than the way, and you can understand why our general mainstream society would find that a difficult context, and the context that you spoke about as, but he was a teacher, he was well liked, he was always helpful to his neighbours, or whatever kind of comments like that. It's a lot easier to understand that and to make sense of it than what really goes on in domestic violence.
Okay, Pauline, now you've often said that domestic and family violence, a large percentage of which is men's violence against women in the home, you've often said it's an all-of-community problem and that the solution must come from the community. I want you to elaborate on that.
That is true, Betty, that the solution must come from the community, but it's not just like a localised community response, although that is important as well. But the whole of our society is responsible for violence against women. And we need to look at the way that women are socialised in our society, the way men are socialised in our society. It is my belief that men are subtly socialised to have contempt for women, to see them as being less significant, in fact sometimes to set them up as being difficult and manipulative, and those sorts of ideas that are that men and women are socialised with in our society. So the whole of society needs to look at their attitudes and beliefs about men and men's role in our society, and women's role. All of that needs disbanding and dealing with. But in terms of our local community, my view is we have domestic violence in this community, in our small local community here, not much bigger than Duluth really, a regional North Queensland community. And domestic violence is enormous in our community, and we're no different from any other community. So if we're going to have a toleration for it in our community, then the community has to be aware of it, they have to take some responsibility for it, and they do have a role in stopping and preventing violence. And so we do have some programs, government-funded programs on early intervention, for example, for teaching in schools about healthy relationships, it's often called, and non-violent behaviours. But we can't just have those as little standalone programs that get taught in this school to this class and it never gets mentioned again. It absolutely needs to be a whole lifestyle change. Now we know that if you look at other lifestyle change activities such as, say, driving with seatbelts or drink driving, the enormous amount of education and opportunities for people to be aware that it's against the law, that there is a law against it, that you must wear a seatbelt, for example, and if you don't wear a seatbelt you will be punished. There will be some sort of consequences of you flouting that law. But enable for us to all understand that, we receive enormous amounts of education lessons about that. So it would be even children are taught to, there's little ditties around about click clack, and don't let your parents drive off until you've checked that everyone's in seatbelts. So even intergenerationally we're trying to educate the importance of doing that particular behaviour change. And so when we look at the behaviour change, expectations in our society, there's nothing on that scale at all. And in fact, so many of the myths and so many of the ideas about who men are, who they are in our society, how they're more important than us, who women are, how men can tell women who they are and how they need to behave, all of that behaviour is still going on. And I'm sure that the Temperance League and the suffragettes and the earlier movements in the women's movement all tried tackling these problems, and they were just the same now as they were then. We've only got to look at our own Australian federal government to see that we recently had a 100% increase in how many women were represented in our federal government, and so we went from 1 woman to 2. Clearly, we're not getting a very strong equality message into the sort of role models, I guess, that we have in our society. So yes, saying that responding to domestic violence is the whole of community responsibility, it absolutely is. We need to have far more education and much more public notice about what domestic violence really is, the damage that it's doing. We should be holding the people doing the damage accountable for their use of violence. There should be a lot of laws, there should be mandates, they should be assisted to change their behaviour, similar to what we see in things like the Seatbelts campaign, for example. We should be saying that as a community of Townsville with our 160,000 people who live here, that we're ashamed to have such a program, such an issue, where the women and children in this society are not safe than the men who live with them and who love them. We should be really taking this issue on and saying that that here in Townsville we've got 2 women's shelters. Why should we even have that? Hidden women's shelters, places that women can retreat to and hide to when they're in danger of being hurt or killed by their partners. Why would we want to tolerate that in this community? I would like to see a community that faces all of this head on, that really says, no, we don't want this stuff in our community. And when we talk about violence against women, we're talking about quite broad things, not only the domestic violence, the punching, the hitting, the name calling and so on. We're also talking about the sexual assault, the fact that women are not safe in the streets or they don't feel like they're safe. We're talking about stalking. We're talking about the extremes of violence where women and children get killed. Why are we talking about that in a setting like this, and yet our community is not talking about it and in fact would rather turn a blind eye to it in many ways?
Well, that's really good, Pauline. And I know that you were one of the people responsible for starting a group in Townsville called Dovetail. And it's a group that still meets regularly. It's a group that where people, representatives from different services in the community get together around domestic violence, like the police, mental health, different legal services, the defence community here in Townsville, which is a rather large community. All of those people get together once a month or so to talk about domestic violence, and it's like dovetailing together. And of course, that's what you mean when you talk about an all-of-community response. So thank you. Now, in our next interview, I'll be asking Pauline to talk more about the community's response thus far. I'll ask her about politicians' response, the law, the police, and so on. So I hope you'll join us for our third interview in this series.